Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar on the new Form I-9, a step-by-step guide. This is Huynh, and along with me is my partner, Debra Schneider, and we are very excited to have you join us today to talk about this new Smart Form I-9. Before we start, I do want to go over some housekeeping matters. First, if you hover over the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A feature. We have a lot of information today to share with you, so we will be taking questions at the end of our webinar. Please feel free to type in your questions in the area where it allows for you to pose the questions, and we will be sure to address them at the end of the webinar. In addition, we have an upcoming in-person seminar by Ann Radolinsky and Ashley Thornson of the Employment and Labor Group on February 23rd. For more information about it and to register, please look at fredlaw.com/events. We would love for you to join us for the paid leave program that Ann Radolinsky and Ashley Thornton will be presenting on February 23rd. We have also been approved for HRCI, SHRM, and Iowa and Minnesota CLE credits. We will send out the credit information to attendees in a follow-up email. So let's move on now to the Form I-9. We're going to focus on 3 C's for this webinar: I-9 changes, completion, and compliance. So, as you may know, there is now a new Form I-9. The I-9 form was released on November 14, 2016, but we had a transition period between that time of November 14th until January 22nd of 2017. As of January 22nd, 2016, all employers are required to use the new Form I-9. We often refer to this I-9 as the Smart Form I-9. And for our webinar today, we will go over the I-9 each section by section. We're also going to provide you with practical advice as to the completion of the Form I-9 and also talk about government audits and compliance. This is a new administration that we are currently under, and we are definitely preparing to see increased enforcement efforts by this current administration. So we will definitely share some insights for you as to how you can maintain I-9 compliance and be prepared for those government audits. Let's go over a brief history of the I-9 form itself. I think it's always really helpful to understand the purpose of the I-9. The I-9 form was created as a result of the Immigration and Reform Control Act of 1986, which implemented the law stating that all employers had to verify the identification and employment authorization of all new hires employed after November 6, 1986. What's interesting about the law at that time was it was a quid pro quo for the passage of the amnesty program that was passed under President Reagan in 1986. In return for the amnesty program, which allowed about 3 million undocumented individuals in the United States to apply for legal status, the I-9 form was created to require employers to set up an employment verification system to hopefully stop the flow of undocumented immigration into the United States. Well, as you know, it hasn't really quite stopped the flow, and we have about 11 million undocumented individuals living in the United States right now. The stakes for I-9 compliance has gotten even higher because of the potential criminal fines and civil fines that an employer can receive as a result of an I-9 audit. As of August 2016, the fines for I-9 paperwork violations increased from 110 to 216 per violation for a first-time violation. In terms of the fines for unlawful employment of unauthorized workers, for a first offense, previously, prior to August 2016, an employer could be fined from $375 to $3,200 per violation. After August 1st, 2016, the employer can now be fined from $539 to $4,313. So there's been a significant increase and higher stakes now for employers to maintain compliant I-9 forms for all of its employees hired after November 6, 1986. Let's take a look now at the new I-9. Before we go into the new I-9, we do want to share with you some I-9 resources. In the past 8 years, we have found that the USCIS, United States Immigration Service, has been very good and provided excellent resources for employers on the use of the I-9, along with resources for employees too. So we have some listed on the screen for you. The new Form I-9 can be loaded at this link. In addition, there is the Handbook for Employers Guidance for Completing Form I-9. When the new Form I-9 was released in November, USCIS stated that it would be issuing the Handbook for Employers Guidance for Completing Form I-9 before January 22nd. As of today, we have not received the revised handbook. So really all employers have now at this time for guidance in regards to the new Form I-9 or the instructions that have been released with the Form I-9 along with I-9 Central, the website. It's a great resource for employers to the I-9 Central website, and we encourage you to take a look at it. There's also the Guide to Selected U.S. Travel and Identity Documents. That document is still the same with a revision edition of January 2011. We are so grateful that you are with us for this webinar, but I do want to stress that there are many other resources out there that I encourage you to use to share with your employees as you start training on the new I-9, in addition to the fact that you are using it now. USCIS and EVerify are providing several webinars on the new Form I-9. We've attended some of them ourselves. It's pretty much a basic overview of the Form I-9, and what we hope today is to share with you some insights that you may not receive during those webinars, and also questions that we have received a lot from our own clients regarding this new Form I-9. So let's take a closer look at the new Form I-9. I'm going to go now, and I'm going to move to the actual screen when you click on the USCIS website for the new Form I-9. So you can see what you have as an employer. You have many choices now as to the Form I-9. There is now the PDF fillable Smart I-9 form that you can choose to use to complete your Form I-9, or you can also use the paper version. The Form I-9 is still a 2-page I-9 form. In addition, the third page is the list of acceptable documents. So that is how it has changed from the 2013 version. You now have the list of acceptable documents attached as part of the Form I-9. The instructions are separate The instructions now are 15 pages of instructions, and I will show you what they look like. But as you can see on the screen here, in addition to the 2 versions that now employers have the option of using, you also have a Form I-9 Supplement Section 1 Preparer or Translator Certification that Debra is going to talk more in detail about. This did not exist in the prior edition. You also have here the 15-page instructions that I briefly mentioned earlier. You also have the Form I-9 in Spanish. You can use this I-9 form to share with your Spanish-speaking employees. However, if you are outside of Puerto Rico, you cannot use this to have them fill out the Form I-9. If you are outside of Puerto Rico, you still have to use the English version of the Form I-9 to be in compliant. And this should only be used to provide instructions to those who may need assistance in the Spanish language. You also have the instructions for the Form I-9 in Spanish that you can also share with your employees. And as we previously stated, the handbook is also here. This is the website where you can access all that information. And now I'm going to go to the actual Form I-9 that is available. Let me see here. And this is a Form I-9 that we actually filled out prior to our presentation. And to show you what it actually looks like, this is what we call the Smart Online Fillable I-9, not the paper version. And it looks a little bit different from the paper version in that the I-9 form is a 2-page form, but when you look at it on the web, it is a 4-page form. But when you print it out, it will be 2 pages as the paper version that you can also have the option of using. We expect that many employers are still going to be using the paper version until they are able to train their HR team or their I-9 individuals who will be responsible for completing the I-9 on their behalf to use the fillable smart form. So let's look at some of the features available on this new form, and we'll go over in detail more about it later. But now you have a you can hover over this question mark, which will allow you to have guidance on each of the field provided on the I-9. So this was not available before. When you hover over this question mark, the USCIS has provided additional guidance as to what needs to be entered and how you should fill out in that information. So this is a great feature that wasn't available. It's only available, of course, if you use the online version. Now, to use the online version of the Form I-9, it has become clear to us that you have to have Adobe Acrobat version 8, and Debra will discuss more about it. But there have been some problems in the usage of this online form under certain I believe, Chrome programs. So you have to make sure that you have the technology to be able to use this form. And that is probably one of the biggest obstacles that we see employers facing as they start testing out this new form, I-9, the online version. In the meantime, you can use, as I stated previously, the paper version. We talked about the instructions. If you use this online program, you can actually click on the instructions automatically here, and it will take you to specific instructions on the I-9. There are new features here where you can start over, and you have print versions too that you can also print. I want to really stress to you that this is not an electronic I-9 software program. What the USCIS has provided you is just a online smart PDF fillable form that you can upload to your computer and save and complete it using these new features that USCIS has provided. you still must complete the Form I-9. The law is still the same in regards to the fact that you have to sign the I-9 and review the I-9 in person. So that is something that we have gotten a lot of questions about, is can I just fill it out and sign it electronically? And the law is still the same in that you still must print out the I-9 form, whether you use the paper version or the online form, and apply a wet signature, for better words, in regards to Section 1 for the employee and Section 2. You should also note that the interaction with EVerify remains the same. There are additional features that we'll go over, such as the QR code box and additional information. But I want to stress that the law is still the same for the Form I-9. It hasn't changed. You still must fill out the I-9 by the 3rd business day of employment as an employer, and the employee still must complete Section 1 of the I-9 by the 1st date of employment. So the I-9 laws are the same. The new I-9 form may look different, and there may be additional features. As to how do you actually use the I-9 in its current state, there are some practical options that you have now to use the new Form I-9. One recommendation that we have is any procedures that you implement should be written and be applied consistently across the board. As I've stated previously, we expect many employers to still use the paper version until they are more comfortable with the smart fillable form. But if you want to use the new I-9 form to its fullest potential, the way we see it being done is that an employer can send the electronic or the smart I-9 form to a newly hired employee after they have accepted an offer, send it to them in PDF form, and ask that they complete the Section 1 by the 1st day of employment. Have them send it back to the employer electronically, and be prepared to present their Section 1 completed and signed on their 1st day of employment. The employer can then pull up what the employee has sent back to them electronically and complete Section 2. And the reason that it would be helpful to have the same online form that the employee completed is that there are some features that will be automatically populated in Section 2 if you use the same online form that the employee used. And we'll show you that later on in our presentation. Another option is just to have the employee complete Section 1 electronically, have them print it out, bring it to you on the 1st day of employment, have your HR representative or I-9 representative just pull up Section 2 online, a new I-9 form, and fill it out electronically within 3 business days. So there are many options now that employers have, and our recommendation is to implement procedures that allow you to fulfill the minimum requirement for I-9 compliance, which is to complete the I-9 timely, fully, and correctly. So despite all of these options, every employer is going to be different depending on your company size, your culture, the many locations you may have as a company, and you're going to have to determine what works best for you now that you have all of these options. And of course, always consult with legal counsel if you have any questions. So Debra is now going to discuss with you Section 1 of the Form I-9 and go into details on some of the changes in the Form I-9 Section 1.
Thank you, Lon. So as we've been talking about, this is the new 4 pages that you'll see if you use the smart form. And you'll become familiar with all of them as we go along. So I'm going to first take a look at what you see. This is a little bit of a close-up of page 1. A few questions have come up that I think I'll address at the beginning. And one was a question about what do you do with the 4th page of the online form that includes the list of acceptable documents. And now that you need to provide to the employee so they know what documents to bring when they come to work, but that does not need to be maintained with the I-9. You can toss that or shred it, but you do not need to keep that. But what I find really interesting, I do bring up the Adobe 8 version or higher because I tried to access this form this weekend on my iPad, and I couldn't even get to it. So if you don't have Adobe 8 on your system, it won't even work for you. You're going to have to do the what I'll call the old school version of the PDF to print out and use. So if you take a look, as Lon had indicated, the little question mark, that's going to be your information. And we have gone through this form, and I really actually like it. It seems a little bit odd that you're going to have question marks for basic forms, such as completing your name, address, state, where do you live, but it helps for indications where you may have someone who only has one name, and this will tell you how to complete that. If you look closer at the form, you'll notice that there are a few changes than what you may have been familiar with. The form now includes a section called Other Last Name Used, if any. Many of you remember that the earlier versions of the form had one time said maiden name, and then they had changed it to other names used, and now they've clarified that they're only looking for other last names used. So that provides a bit of clarity. You'll also see additions such as U.S. Social Security number, the employee's email address, and employee's telephone number. The U.S. Social Security number only needs to be provided if you are a company who is registered with EVerify. Otherwise, your employee has the option of leaving that blank or putting NA. The same thing goes with their email address and their telephone number. And you may be thinking, why do I need to have someone's email address and telephone number listed on here? Well, they have, Immigration has noted that if your employee lists their email address and you are an EVerify company, when you enter the I-9 information into the EVerify system, if there is a tentative non-confirmation, the EVerify system will also notify your employee through this email address if there has been a mismatch or a tentative non-confirmation. This doesn't alleviate the employer's obligation to also fulfill its EVerify duties of providing its own notice to the employee, but it also gives the employee direct communication with EVerify. And so that's the section, that top part that we had just looked at. I also want to note a few things that you may not have seen before to notice that it also provides an anti-discrimination notice. It advises the employee that the instructions must be available for them to complete on the form. So another question has come up to say, do we need to provide them with the instructions? One option is if you advise your employee to go to the I-9 website to complete section 1, the instructions are embedded in the form. If they click on the instructions, they automatically will have access to them. And some of the sections, when you click on the question mark, if they had questions regarding am I a citizen of the United States, they also will have links to the instructions where they can get guidance. The 15 pages of instructions are pretty thorough, and they're written not only for the employer who's going to complete section 2 and holds a liability for this form, but also for the employee completing the form itself to answer their questions. Please also take a look at the form because you'll see that it advises the employee that the employer cannot specify what document to present for Section 2. And it also gives the employee notice that it could be illegal discrimination to refuse to hire or continue to employ an individual because the documentation presented has a future expiration date. That's new and not something we had seen highlighted so thoroughly. So here in Section 1, here's what it will look like. You fill in their personal information, very straightforward. And then again, to reiterate, the newer options that you see here and how they're listed. Now we'll go to the second section that your employee needs to complete. This is the attestation. Please note the first thing it does is it advises the employee that they can be imprisoned or fined for using false statements or using false documents in completing the Form I-9. The same instructions also provide warnings if they make a false claim to be a U.S. citizen. a closer look, you'll note that there's 4 boxes for your employee to check, and they're also attesting by signing and checking these boxes under the penalty of perjury. The first one, fairly straightforward. Are they a citizen of the United States? All they do is check the box. A non-citizen or national of the United States, to be honest, this is going to be very rarely checked. This is generally for those who are American Samoans, former citizens of trust territory of the Pacific Islands, or children of non-citizen nationals born abroad. So it'd be very rare for you to see this checked. More common you may see is Section 3, which is for lawful permanent residents, who are also now required to complete their alien registration number, or USCIS number. What the USCIS number is basically their alien number without the A before it. The other, number 4, is going to be an alien or a foreign national with work authorization who is authorized to work until a specific date. Now, this is going to be where your employee will fill out what date they believe their documentation or work authorization will expire. It's important, you do not need to see what document they gave to pick this date, and in fact, you cannot ask to see that date. You may have certain aliens who will write NA. Most likely those will be individuals who are in a protected status, such as an asylees or refugees. So they do not have to put a specific date, but they do have to list something. So if they don't have a date, they would have to put NA. There's now a second part where not only do they have to then provide a date in that top line, but they also need to address either number 1, 2, or 3 below. And what this is referring to is that if they have an alien registration number, they can list that in number 1. Or they can list their I-94 admission number, which is as many work authorized immigrants, non-immigrants have when they're working for you, for example, under H-1B status. Or they can provide their passport and country of issuance. A section that we also note is this QR code that Lon had referenced, which is the same thing that you see on many documents if you put your cell phone up to it and it can read it. And what it is going to be potentially in the future, this code will be, it'll show up once it's finished and printed. And this may be what ICE will use in the future when running audits to have an easier verification system of acquiring this data. It's nothing you need to do or complete. So here's an example of an application completed by a permanent resident. They've checked box 3, they've included their alien number, and the rest has been included automatically, had listed NA. It is signed and dated, and the date will be the date the employee completes this. As everyone knows, this can be done in advance of their start date, but it must be done by the first date they report to work, and it should only be completed after the offer has been made. Here's an example of one for where Section 4 is checked of an alien authorized to work. You'll see it includes an expiration date, and then they included the information listed at Section 1, their alien number, also signed and dated. Here's a similar example, except in this case the individual chose to provide their passport. The passport number has been listed, the country of issuance, and again signed and dated. Next, you'll see the Preparer and Translator certification. Again, this is for your employee to complete. What's new with this new smart form is that there's 2 boxes. 1, I did not use a translator. 2, a translator assisted. You do have to now check this box. Failure to have this box checked by your employee can be considered a technical violation. So in most cases, if they did not have any assistance in preparing it, they would check the first box. If they do have a preparer or a translator helping them, there's also a box on the right-hand side which will ask how many people assisted. And what happens if you check more than number 1, you will be given a supplement, that the form that Lon had indicated, to allow more than one preparer or translator use this. When would this section be used? If you did have a foreign language interpreter who helped advise the individual on how to complete Section 1. If they were a minor and their parent attested to them. There's also special placement rules for certain individuals who have disabilities. Again, there's also a notice where it says to click to finish. This is where it will save all the information, but it will also give notice to the employee if they're making a mistake. If they've missed a box, if they forgot to include anything, it will give them that helpful tip. And so here's how it looks completed. Very straightforward. And now we'll move on to Section 2, which is where the employer will take over. I'll also note, as Lon had said, another option is when your employee brings in, if they do bring in a handwritten I-9, you could then enter that same information as you complete Section 2 and 3, and that will help limit the amount of choices you have when you complete Section 2 and 3.
Thank you, Debra. So let's look at Section 2. Section 2, I will go back and forth to the sample I-9 form that we prepared to share with you, but when you look at Section 2, in 2013 they added this employee information from Section 1, and during our I-9 audit matters or cases, we have found that this is an area that most employers forget to fill out on Section 2. So if you use the online Smart I-9, it will automatically be completed if you're using the same online form that the employee previously used. If not, then you're going to have to manually type in the information. So a new feature that we see here on this Section 2 of the new Form I-9, if you use the online form, is that there are instructions just like Section 1 had. For example, document title. Here you see the example of the specific instructions regarding document title, list A of documents that are provided, and guidance as to what needs to be done. Now you're going to only have access to this if you use the fillable form. Otherwise you'll use the instructions that are provided, the 15 pages of instructions that are provided if you use a paper version. And you are required to provide the employee instructions along with the list of acceptable documents. Now, as I previously stated, the list of acceptable documents is part of the Form I-9, so they'll get it when you give them the Form I-9. Previously it wasn't. The instructions are 15 pages that are separate. So in the instructions that are provided, USCIS has stated that the employer must provide the employee with both the instructions and lists of acceptable documents. Let's go on to the next slide here. This is how it will look as the online smart form. The paper version will not have all of these drop-down menus and question marks that you see here. And a feature that I want to focus on that didn't exist before is the citizenship and immigration status that is noted up here. That didn't exist before, and this box here really relates to what is checked in Section 1, where the employee checked their immigration status or their citizenship status. This specific number refers to an employee who checked that they were authorized to work. So the reason this is important for Section 2 is that the guidance that the online form will provide to you as to the type of acceptable documents is going to relate to this information here that you enter if you're using the online form. If you're using a paper version, it doesn't matter. You still have to fill it out, but it's not going to be helpful in regards to the guidance and how it's tied to the information in Section 1. The employer still must physically examine the documents that is provided to the employer and complete this form within 3 business days. We call it the Thursday rule. If they start on Monday, then you have to make sure your I-9 form is completed by the end of Thursday. So please note that just because it's an online form doesn't mean that you can complete it without looking at your employee, having that employee physically present or present the documents and be physically in front of you. That is still a requirement under the law. As we noted, there is assistance throughout the form, similar to Section 1, but we also have in Section 2 now the drop-down box for lists A, B, and C, which provides you the options available for each of the section or the list of acceptable documents. And this is a great feature because it is hoped that these features will alleviate document abuse, where employers take on more than is required to establish the employment eligibility or identity of an employee. What we see a lot in our I-9 audits is that you'll have list A completed along with list B and C, and that is against the law. That can be considered document abuse because you've taken too many documents from the employees to establish their employment eligibility and identity. So this feature here of providing drop-down boxes and also providing error messages if you provide too much information is also part of the new feature of the Form I-9. And I'm going to give you an example of that right now. So let me go to the form that we filled out. So as you can see here, we filled out the form where it's Section 4, alien authorized to work. And when you go to Section 2 here, you have here number 4, as I previously discussed with you, as the citizenship and immigration status, because it's the same form. And if I go in here and I choose U.S. passport, look what happens. It will state that this document does not correlate with the citizenship or immigration status the employee chose in Section 1. As immigration attorneys who really focus on I-9 audits and compliance, we love this feature of the fillable form I-9. And we're really excited about that. We're I-9 geeks, and these kind of features that are added to this very complicated 2-page form makes us very excited for our clients if you can use it correctly. And that, of course, is the key, is to be able to use it correctly and to its fullest potential. So along with the drop-down menus in List A, you'll also have drop-down menus for List B and C. What is also very helpful in this new Form I-9 is that for the list of acceptable documents, for the instructions that are provided, as you can see here, it's pretty similar to the prior version, you know, 1 page of list of acceptable documents. But when you click on the actual options here, it's much more in-depth. And this information is also provided on the paper version of the instructions. So if you use the paper version, the instructions will lay out all of these various options that you also see here on the online Form I-9. So you do have access to this information in the 15-page instructions. But the list of acceptable documents is pretty much the same. However, I'm going to go back to, let me go back to the screen right now. Okay, sorry about that. So as you can see here, these are the various documents, and it's really interesting because what they've written out are the receipt options that are available. As you know, an employer may accept receipt versions of any lost, stolen, or damaged documents as part of the receipt rule. That rule still applies. And the list of acceptable documents, as I've stated, is pretty much the same that you previously had. You also want to make sure that the rules regarding Social Security restrictions also apply. But there's a feature that we really also love on this section too, and that is the additional information feature. And Debra's going to discuss how we can use it which we previously did not have as a feature in the prior I-9 form, and give you some insights on a new piece of law that isn't even provided in the instructions, the written instructions. Debra, can you talk about the additional information box and how it can be used?
Sure. So this is useful because for many of you know, when you are, say you have an H-1B employee porting, or you have a special cap-gap rule for H-1Bs, there was never a good place to enter that information, and we may have advised you, well, write really small in the box right beside to include this information. And so now they've actually created a box where you can put all those very odd situations, usually dealing with foreign students and foreign workers, that provide a place to list exactly and clarify the information that you're including on the I-9. One new rule I'll talk about that began on January 17th. So what happened is new regulations were published on employment-based immigration. And with this new regulation, what happened is the government has taken away its 90-day rule. As many of you may have known, for many, many years, the government under regulation has had 90 days to approve an employment authorization document. They have now taken away their deadline. They have no deadline of when to issue an EAD. And in exchange, they have said that certain categories of EAD extension applications will be automatically extended for 180 days while it's pending. This does include many employment-based extensions for employment authorization documents, including those with pending adjustment applications. What this means, it has now changed your I-9 rule for acceptance of a receipt. So individuals who will present to you a 797 receipt notice for an EAD extension, and it will have to say on the receipt notice that this is a receipt providing for 180 days of employment authorization, that can now be accepted under I-9s. This is so new, it's not in the instructions and it's not yet in the handbook, so you won't find this, but you may start seeing employees and new hires presenting this. So we wanted you to be aware of this new rule, and this sample that you see right in front of you explains how to fill this out. So this may be very helpful to keep. Of course, you may reach out to us if you have additional questions, but this is where you're going to be entering these kind of oddities and this few bits of information.
So in our discussion with the Immigration Service, when we talked about this new feature, it also informed us, Debra, I think that we also have to go up to amend Section 1 where it says authorized until a certain date and put in the new date of the automatic extension. And the EAD automatic extension, when you submit a renewal, only applies to certain EAD extensions, not all. And I think it's really confusing for employers because it's not provided in the instructions. And I think that you're going to have to be really careful when you get this document. We received a EAD renewal receipt letter recently for one of our employees, and it had a language that, you know, the EAD can be automatically extended, but it wasn't for a category where the Immigration Service accepted the 180-day renewal for this specific category. So be very cautious in regards to it. It was for a intra-company L2 spouse, which is not provided the 180-day renewal, and yet the USCIS sent a receipt notice with instructions about this 180-day and being able to use it as proof of your employment authorization, with a caveat that and the employer had to confirm it. So be very careful about that. But it's a law that we are happy to see. So in regards to Section 2, this is an example of when an employee has presented a driver's license and an unrestricted Social Security card. And we provided this example to emphasize that, again, the law is still the same. You can only use a Social Security card that's unrestricted. But what's great is this drop-down box will let you know that if you're using the online form, that it reminds you that it has to be unrestricted. So that is a really good example of how this online form can be more helpful to employers and employees. The certification requirement is still the same. We did not receive any new instructions for remote hires, and the reason I want to bring this up is we get a lot of questions regarding remote hires. The Immigration Service has maintained its position that as I've previously stated, the employer still must physically examine the documents and see the employee in front of them as they affirm or attest to the identity of the employee. Now, when I say employer, what I mean is that you can also have a representative that is an employer representative. Most companies often hear about notary publics as helping the employer fill out a Form I-9 remotely because they don't have an office in a city, but it doesn't have to be a notary public. Actually, in some states, a notary public cannot do this type of attestation. So you can have anyone do it who is willing to take on the responsibility of the employer's attestation requirements, and it doesn't have to be just a notary public. The best practice for remote hires is that if you're going to have someone represent your company in another state to do the I-9 on your behalf is to have written instructions for the employee and also your representative who is going to be acting on behalf of the company. Skype is not acceptable. So, Debra, let's go through re-verification really quickly, since we have a lot of great questions and we want to get to them too.
Excellent. So I will go through section 3, which is used to re-verify someone's employment authorization. You don't use this to re-verify someone's identity unless they've come to you with an entirely new identity, and there are instructions on what to do in that case, but also used for rehires. And I'll go through this quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time and have a lot to talk about. So this section of the form, again, you'll note another place you could have an easy technical violation is forgetting to include the employee name from section 1. Kind of silly, but you have to keep writing their name down, so don't forget to do that. And then it explains when you need to complete it. So it does have a section for new names. So this could be if someone married. You are not legally required to update your I-9 if someone does have a name change. While USCIS encourages this practice, it is not legally mandated. Now, however, if you have someone who is being rehired, there's a few options. Rehire is available if your I-9 is less than 3 years old from the first date it was completed and they're rehired during that period of time. If nothing has changed, so they haven't changed their name and they had potentially, say, for example, checked U.S. citizen and nothing has changed regarding their documentation, all you need to do is put the date of rehire, sign, and date, and put the name of the person who reviewed that. If you are doing re-verification, so you're checking someone's work authorization documents, again, you list their employee name in section 1, and then you would list the document title, the document number they have presented to you, and the new expiration date. Again, you do have to see those documents, and then you, of course, the employer would sign and date. Again, please don't forget all documents accepted cannot be expired. That is a rule that's been in place for quite some time. And we've received quite a few questions about the practice of copying documents. I know Lon and I both have recommended, if you do have a policy to copy documents, to always do so for every hire. And why is it helpful? Well, as Lon will get to, when we do audits, internal audits, or we're dealing with an ICE audit, that helps you avoid fines and violations because it helps us fix or correct I-9s that can be corrected. And so, Lon, with that in mind, could you give some best tips and practices for I-9 maintenance?
Sure. So I-9 maintenance remains the same. The law is the same. You must maintain the I-9 form for at least 3 years from the date of hire or 1 year after the end of employment, whichever is later. I am not good at math, but I know in the handbook for employers there is a formula that the Immigration Service has provided to employers to use. So I recommend you take a look at it as you try to determine what dates you have to maintain the I-9. The key is that you don't want to maintain documents that you don't have to. In case you are facing an I-9 audit, you want to make sure that your I-9s are separate from your personnel files, and you separate the I-9s of your current employees from your terminated employees, so you don't give the immigration or ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, who has jurisdiction over I-9 enforcement, too many documents. You want to give them only what you're required to under the law. So that's something to keep in mind. We talked about supporting documents and attaching the documents. Personally, in our discussion with clients when we are advising on I-9 maintenance, we have stated that it is our experience that those who have maintained supporting documents have been able to avoid fines where you may have an employer who has not maintained documents, and they may not have anyone in their workforce who provided fraudulent documents. They can still face fines if they don't have supporting documents. And the reason supporting documents are helpful is that in 1996, through the Sonny Bono Amendment, I love to give Sonny Bono the credit for this, even though he has passed away. This is a great provision because what it did was it stated that if employers have supporting documents and they've made mistakes, technical paperwork mistakes on their I-9, they can go back and correct those mistakes during an I-9 audit. And that has saved a lot of employers I-9 fines during the past 8 years when there's been such a significant increase in I-9 audits. We've had employers where 50% of their workforce was lost because the individuals provided fraudulent documents. They didn't face any fines because they had supporting documents to correct their I-9s. You as an employer are not required to be a forensic expert, and as long as you meet the minimum requirements of completing the I-9 and do it to the best of your ability, that should help you in an I-9 audit. The key also is to maintain the I-9s where you can have them ready for immigration review within 3 business days, because that's how much you are usually given in an I-9 audit when you received a notice of a I-9 audit. So in regards to preparing for government I-9 audits, we want to emphasize again, have a third party review your I-9s, whether it's legal counsel or someone who is an expert on I-9 forms. With legal counsel, you are protected under the client attorney confidential communication and work privilege provisions. So it's always good to have legal counsel review your I-9s and do an annual audit at minimum. It's never too late to correct the I-9s. During these audits, just be very transparent about them and make sure you initial any changes that you make to it. Also, never backdate any I-9s. Establish a I-9 audit response plan. That is the best way to protect yourself, is to be ready for an audit. Always act or believe that you will be audited and not take it for granted that you're just filling out the form I-9 and they're never going to be looked at. Also, we haven't talked about EVerify a lot, but I definitely want to make sure we acknowledge that EVerify is still an option for some employers to sign up for, and we will probably see an increase in EVerify under this current administration. There's been discussion about the mandatory implementation of EVerify. It may not happen, but we do expect it to be expanded. So if you do use EVerify, you're going to have to ensure that you're in compliance with not only the I-9 form, but the EVerify requirements too. We definitely expect to see further disruption in workforce through workforce enforcement actions, as the current administration has expressed that it will go after individuals who are here undocumented and may have criminal histories or just they're here undocumented. So we see this administration as a combination of the Bush administration, where they really focus on worksite enforcement and worksite raids, and the Obama administration, where they focus on I-9 audits. We see it coming all together in a big tornado here for employers. And what we advise our employers is just be prepared. We've pulled out our Know Your Rights cards for employers that we created many years ago during the Bush administration, and have it to share with you if you would like a copy of it. They're little cards outlining what the rights of the employers are if you are contacted by government officials for any type of audits or investigations. But also know that your employees have rights too. We've gotten a lot of calls from employers as to what should we do? We don't want to get in trouble with this new administration, so what should we do if we're contacted by the Immigration Service regarding an employee? And our advice is contact us or your legal counsel. Always know that no matter who contacts you, you want to be cooperative, but you have the right to say that I would like to contact legal counsel or have legal representatives present if I am going to engage in a discussion with you. So know your rights, protect your employees also, because they are entitled to certain privacy rights too, and you don't want to take any action that may infringe on their privacy and be vulnerable to other types of enforcement issues in addition to I-9 or immigration issues. So we're going to go now, I believe, to questions, right, Debra?
Yeah, and I'll answer a few that I noticed when I was talking about re-verification and rehire, and I know I went through that fairly quickly, so I'm going to pause and go back because there's quite a few questions on when do you re-verify an employee's documentations and what is an employer's obligations in that. So let me give you one tip. Actually, I'll give you a few tips. First, always use the current I-9 form when you're completing Section 3 and doing re-verification. So if you had hired someone, say, 2 years ago, that form was valid as of the 22nd, you always have to use this new current form, whether it's the printed PDF or what we'll call the smart form. What you do is use that Section 3. Do not go back to the old I-9 and use that Section 3, even if it's blank and looks like it could be used. You have to use the new form. So make sure you're using the new form, and what you do is attach that to the old I-9. So you want to keep them together. Second tip, you never need to re-verify a lawful permanent resident or a conditional lawful permanent resident unless they provided a receipt. So if they presented a green card as part of their Section A, you never need to re-verify it. Even if it expires, you don't need to do anything further. They provided enough evidence of work authorization. You do not have to re-verify them. Another tip is don't ask to see a specific document. They can present any List A or List C document. Again, why I stated you don't need to provide identity is because hopefully someone's identity isn't going to change. But if someone had presented an employment authorization document, for example, that will have an end date. And there are two dates you need to look at. One, the date of the document they gave you in Section 3 that has an end date, or the date they put in page 1 if they listed an alien authorized to work until. Those dates may not be consistent depending on what documentation they showed you. You need to follow up with that employee on the earliest expiration date. And again, they can present for you. It doesn't have to be a new employment authorization document. They can present any other List A or List C document that provides evidence. The rule has pretty much been to usually provide 90-day notice prior to an expiration, but it is the employee's obligation to provide you with documentation up till that expiration date to continue working. So one of these questions was, what happens if their alien card has expired? Again, green cards you do not need to re-verify. Employment authorization documents you do. Also for the receipt rule, after you've docketed that 180 days, they do need to provide for you either that original employment authorization card after that 180-day mark or other evidence of eligibility to work.
Okay, so I will go on, and we received many questions, and we're very excited about them, and we'll try to get through as quickly as possible. One question: if the new hire completes Section 1 of the first day and sends electronic form to HR, and HR completes the rest on day 2 or 3, then prints it out, how will new hire sign it on day 1? Our recommendation is if you use the online smart form, send it to the employee before the first date of employment after the offer has been accepted, and ask them to complete it and date it on or before the first date of employment and turn it in to HR on that first day. It's up to you, the employer, as to whether you complete the Section 2 on that same date or within 3 business days of employment. Okay, may a Minnesota notary verify the I-9? If you are an employer and you have someone who works remotely and you cannot do it yourself, or one of your existing representatives do it, you can ask a Minnesota notary public who is willing to take on the responsibility of completing this Section 2 to do it. So it's California that has been a big issue for some employers. The notary public in California, there was a huge issue with that, so it's not Minnesota that we're aware of. If someone brings in a Social Security card with a restriction valid for work only with DHS authorization, will the drop-down prompt us to get that authorization? So the use of unrestricted work authorization for a Social Security card is this. If there's any notation regarding work authorization on the Social Security card, that is a restricted Social Security card. That informs the employer that this document by itself does not establish employment eligibility. And that's why in the drop-down box in the list C, you have an unrestricted Social Security card, because it means there's no notation regarding work authorization is required. So Debra, you want to go with some other questions? And then we'll come back.
Another person asked, if an existing employee presents a 765 receipt, does the employee make any changes to Section 1? Would they initial these? Great question. No, Section 1 does not need to be updated or changed, just the employer's obligation to update at Section 3 of the ReVerification. Another one says, if we need to correct the format of the date written by the employee with their signature, does the employee need to correct the format, or can we do it for them? Again, just as Lon had talked about, Section 1, the only changes that can be made to Section 1 is by the employee. So you would need to ask them to come in and make the correction and then date and initial that.
Okay, great. Going through some other questions, is the authorization card the only form of I-9 that requires us to go back and update the expiration date in Section 1? I presume you mean Section 1 where you've noted worker authorized to work until a certain date. If someone provides you with the EAD renewal receipt notice, you do need to go back. This is really new to us, actually. We found out this requirement because we called USCIS to ask about the procedures for this new card, and we have not had any notice that it's required for other situations, but this one, because it's a renewal situation, it's different from the receipt card situation. So that is the only scenario that we're aware of. If we have I-9s completed and the Section 2 part where we were supposed to put employee information from Section 1 is incomplete, what is the appropriate way to correct this? Do we update the information, date, and initial? Section 1 can only be completed by the employee or a translator or preparer. And remember, if you use a translator or preparer for the employee, they have to fill out that section or the supplemental preparer and translator section if there's more than 2 preparer or translators helping the employee correct Section 1. So the employer should never touch the information in Section 1. If we do a paper form, do we need to write NA on all lines? This is a good question. One of the feature of the online form is that NA does appear and you are required to put it in, or it automatically populates NA in certain sections. If you do the paper version, follow the instructions and write NA where it gives you that option. This is going to be very interesting in the future when we do have I-9 audits, and whether Immigration and Customs Enforcement will find situations where an employee or an employer forgets to write NA. I think we have a really good argument that they should not be fined, but this will be a new area that we're going to be starting to see in the future for I-9 audits. Another question, it is our understanding that every line on the I-9 needs to have an entry of some sort. Again, read the instructions, and if you use the online form, it's not going to let you continue to the next section, or it will alert you if certain sections have to be completed. This is a good question. Can we use DocuSign to gather electronic signatures and be in compliance, or do we have to have live in-person signatures? The only time that you can have electronic signature is if you are using a electronic I-9 software that is in compliance with I-9 regulations. The USCIS government has very specific requirements as to what is a compliant electronic I-9 software program. It has to establish an audit trail, also electronic signatures that can be traced, and there are hundreds of electronic I-9 software programs out there. I really advise you to make sure that you vet all of those I-9 programs and also talk to legal counsel and question those vendors as to whether their electronic I-9 program is in compliance with regulations regarding electronic I-9 software. It's separate regulations and very detailed. It was issued in 2010. This new I-9 form is not an electronic I-9 software. You cannot electronically sign to this I-9, and you should not. The instructions are very specific by the Immigration Service that you have to have wet signatures on this I-9 form if you use the online fillable form and or the paper version. So no electronic signatures unless you're using a valid electronic I-9 software.
Another viewer has asked if they are lawful permanent residents and they provided us a permanent resident ID, a driver's license, and social security card, is that considered too many forms of ID? Yes, that would be considered over-documentation, and that could subject an employer to fines for having too many documents. So if someone presents a list A and B and C document, you can ask them, I only need a list A, this, or I could accept these. Which would you prefer me to include? And only choose one. So only choose either the permanent resident card or the driver's license and social security. If you were doing an internal audit, you would note over-documentation and then cross off, say, for example, the permanent resident card, and then that would help get you into compliance. Another question is, can employers use a combination of the smart form and the printed form? For example, can the employee fill out the printed form, then can the employer use the smart form, the employer section? Yes, absolutely. That's acceptable. Just as a practice tip, it may be useful to re-enter the information the employee put in section 1, just so you get the full benefit of the smart form, but it can be a combination. Another question was issues with printing out, that the contrast and the font is printing very light and they're having to ask their managers to scan and darken it. We've been printing them and they come out fairly clear here. We haven't had that issue. So you may just want to check to see how it's programmed in your system, if there's another way to make the ink darker.
All right, more questions. Did you say that you have to keep the list of documents with the completed Form I-9? No. The Immigration Service has stated that you do not have to maintain the list of acceptable documents as part of your I-9 maintenance. You only need to maintain the 2-page I-9 form or any supplemental form for translators or preparers. So you don't need to maintain the list of acceptable documents. Another question that we got is, can you use the new form to re-verify? Do you also write in the original hire date under the first day of work, even though you are different than the original person who verified at hire? You don't have to be the same person doing re-verification as the individual who actually did the Section 2. It can be a different person. doing the re-verification. Let's see here. For returning H-2B workers, do we have to keep prior I-9s or just the current I-9s? Year I-9. So there's a section in the regulation regarding seasonal workers that I would recommend you refer to and discuss with us online if you need additional information. You can use the existing I-9 that you previously used if it's still maintained, but remember, if you complete section 3 as part of the re-verification form, if they have new employment authorization, it needs to be on the new form I-9, and you will need to attach it. Not to the, you should not use the O version, okay? If we have the new hire fill out the paper form, how will we know what number to put in the citizen immigration box? That's a great question, and that's why you need to make sure that your HR representatives or individuals who are responsible for I-9s are trained. If you're not using the fillable Smart I-9 form, you have to manually fill it out on the paper version and understand what each of those categories mean. So if the employee, for example, checks section 1, then on the second page under immigration and the immigration status, you're going to note the number of the box that they checked in section 1, which would be number 1 if they're a U.S. citizen.
So just to know, it's important that when you're filling out section 2, you should have section 1 with you. You do need to verify that section 1 was completed correctly, because it could be that they check citizen and then they give you documentation that would not establish citizenship. And you as an employer do need to go back to that employee and talk to them about any corrections that may be needed.
Okay. So we have a question here. If we have EVerify, do we have to use a wet signature? And the reason I looked at this question is, please remember the EVerify process is separate from the I-9 process, and your I-9 still need wet signatures. The EVerify procedure supplements the I-9 process. It's not in place of it. So if you are an EVerify user, then you still need to complete the form I-9 and sign it as an employer, and your employee does too. Debra, do you have any
This asks, how can a new employee send section 1 of the form I-9 electronically safely to the employer? And I can understand that, especially if there are social security numbers that they're listing and you don't want them to just send it electronically. You should follow your own data privacy rules that you have governing the transmission of documentation. You may just ask them to bring it with them on their first day of employment in a hard copy if you prefer, or have a platform that allows them to share that information. Another question asked, if we have people complete the I-9 online, how can we verify they were the ones completing the form? Again, for section 1, you do not have to witness the employee completing that, but you will actually observe them and view their documents when you complete section 2.
Again, a question about EVerify. It says, where on EVerify can the additional information field information be provided? Is EVerify changing their format? EVerify has not changed any format or its program that we know in response to this new I-9 form. The additional information field can be used whatever way you as the employer would like to use it. It could be used for your internal notes regarding re-verification. It can be used because you need additional space to fill out list A and you just don't have additional space. So EVerify is still the same, and you should notate notes where EVerify allows you to notate notes. Okay, we do have one more minute left, and we do have some other questions that we've received. We will answer these questions offline because we want to be respectful of our participants' time. Thank you so much for joining us today. This Form I-9 is meant to make the lives of employers and employees easier, and we hope that will happen as employers start training their teams on the new Form I-9. We believe that it can be very helpful if you use it correctly, and the key is obviously having the appropriate technology to do it and setting down procedures to make sure all participants in the I-9 process understand what they have to do and they do it correctly. So thank you again for joining Fredrikson and Byron's immigration team for our I-9 webinar, and please know that we will be continuing to answer any questions that you may have that you submitted that we were not able to get to, and you are always welcome to contact Debra or myself. Our contact information is in your materials, and I also want to note that in your materials we did share with you our I-9 Fast Facts, which is I think a easy, simple resource for you to use to start your training, but there are many more materials that the USCIS has provided that I highly recommend you as the employer look at on the I-9 Central website. So thank you and have a wonderful day.